I don't think I need to attempt to introduce Vice President Al Gore. But last night, I know some of us were at the screening that the Milken Institute hosted of his new film, An Inconvenient Sequel, Truth to Power. And the conversation we're having today is about leading a successful movement. And that certainly came clear, the challenges and the impact in the film last night. So I'm going to start taking us back a little bit, if that's all right. Resilience, one of those qualities of a great leader. I think we all hear about it a lot in corporate settings as well. The year 2000, you conceded the presidential election to President George Bush. You said that you were doing it, I think the quote was, for the unity of the country and the strength of U.S. democracy. But surely that must have been a difficult thing to do, a test of leadership. How did you overcome it, moving on to have such a tremendous impact on the topic of climate change?
Well, first of all, thank you, Anna, for the opportunity to have this conversation with you. And hello, everyone. I'm really happy to be at this Women's Summit, and I congratulate the Milken Institute for putting it on. Now, to your question, I checked the Constitution, and there is really no intermediate step between a final Supreme Court decision and violent revolution. Having briefly considered the latter, I fell back on the old saying from Winston Churchill when he said, the American people generally do the right thing after first exhausting every available alternative. And it really came down to something as simple as that. As for the personal dimension of how you cope with a decision like that, I don't really know how to answer that except to say that at an earlier point in my life, I had gone through some painful experiences, and one in particular when I almost lost a child, and it was a searingly painful experience that actually it has a happy ending, by the way, full recovery and fantastic outcome. But for the month that I spent in the intensive care unit of the hospital at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, it really shook me to my core. And during that experience, I learned a lot. Maybe one of the secrets of the human condition that I'm sure some of you have learned is that we seem to learn the most from the most painful experiences. And one of the learning experiences I had during that time was when there was press about this tragedy, and people that I worked with in the Capitol, I was a senator at the time, and elsewhere, people would come up to me and reach out and share experiences that they had had, and just to kind of, it's another secret of the human condition is that suffering binds us together. And I learned to recognize something that I'm embarrassed to say I was sort of blissfully oblivious to prior to that. And it is that there are people we encounter in everyday life constantly who have gone through incredibly painful experiences, often are still going through them, and they don't really necessarily blurt that out or anything. They just endure and go through it. And if we were to walk down the sidewalk here, we'd run into lots of people who were carrying incredible burdens and going on with their lives. And so I was, you could say, inoculated by that prior experience against the notion of feeling sorry for myself. I was going to be fine. The country, I thought, was another matter, but as far as my own personal experience is concerned, excuse me, I felt like I needed to pick myself up and move on and find another way to live my life in a way that would be useful and make a difference in the world.
So I'll ask a long question, which will enable you to pour yourself a
Okay, all right.
mindful. It's not fully ready to go over there. Okay, last night, Vice President Gore was doing some Q&A with the audience, and a young woman stood up and said that she had seen An Inconvenient Truth when she was 15 years old, so 10 years ago. She's Indonesian, and it inspired her to become a climate change campaigner and work with rural communities in Indonesia on the palm forest deforestation issue, so to make a difference in climate change on the ground. So you inspired her. What inspired you? So why climate change? How did you land there?
Well, the short version is I had a great professor in the 1960s when I was in college. But to back up just a little bit, when I was a little boy, I followed my father around our family farm. And the generation of my father and mother was greatly affected by the Dust Bowl and the soil erosion tragedy the U.S. went through. And I learned from my dad ways to protect the land on our farm. And then my mother read aloud to my sister and me. It was the only book I remember when she would read aloud at the dinner table, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. And I was about 12, I guess, at that time. And that, for me, kind of connected the dots between the early experiences of looking at soil erosion and then seeing, oh my gosh, this can take place on a larger scale. And then I was very fortunate as a college student to learn from a truly great professor named Roger Revelle, a giant of science. He was the first scientist to measure CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere. And in the 1960s, he really painted the picture, connected the dots, and just showed everything that's happened since has been completely consistent with what he taught. He wrote the first scientific paper in 1957 on the threat of global warming. It wasn't called that then, but that's what it was. And he really opened my eyes to the issue of the climate crisis. And I kept in touch with him. And 7 years after I graduated from college, I was elected to the Congress. And I asked what's going on with global warming, and nothing was going on at all. And I got permission from my committee chair to organize the first hearing on global warming and asked my professor to come be the leadoff witness. And I naively thought that all the members of the committee would have the same epiphany that I had had in a full college course, but a 20-minute congressional statement didn't do the trick. And I remember thinking after that, for the first time, how can this be communicated in a way that reproduces the aha moment that I had learning from him? Now, in answer to your question about inspiration, I'll tell you I'll add this one story. As I mentioned, I remained close to him and his family. And I went out to La Jolla, California. This has been several years ago now, for the celebration of the 100th anniversary of Roger Revelle's birth. And his widow was there. She was 98 at the time, and she has since passed. His children were there. A couple of them have gone through my training program now, which was a thrill. But in preparing for that celebration of his centenary, I did even more research on him, and I learned that when he had been a college student, there was a great professor that inspired him to change his life and take the course he did. And you know, another light bulb went off for me, and I thought, how many chains of inspiration go back through the generations where an inspiration by one person leads to another, leads to another. So I think some of the experiences that you all will have here, I was spending time this morning at the Asian Investor Group on climate change, and really inspiring presentations, and I saw a number of people around the table look at, maybe I'm imagining it, but I don't think so. They were taking notes and learning from their colleagues. So these kinds of gatherings can themselves be a source of inspiration.
And there's something also in that about getting them young, you know?
Yeah, well, that certainly was true for me.
Influential. But so you get that spark when you're 12 around the dinner table, but then it looks hard, I have to say. Climate change has taken a while for humanity, governments, corporate interests to accept.
Yeah.
How did you keep going? Because it didn't always look like a straight path to Paris.
No, and not necessarily a straight path from Paris either. But I do think we're now moving as a world community. But I understand your question, and for me, it's not that complicated. And others here have had this experience. When you have the privilege of work that justifies every ounce of energy you can put into it, then, you know, why would you let it go? I mean, it's just a great privilege, and really, in spite of the dangers involved with the climate crisis, it is a source of joy to have work that is really fulfilling and feels like it's extremely worthwhile. And you know, you gotta do it. There's no way I could lay this down, not to sound grandiose about it, but the stakes are so high that, I mean, I never imagined, when I had that first hearing, and before that, I never imagined for one moment that this would consume my life the way it has. I just never imagined it. My mother and father also gave me and my sister a very deep appreciation for and devotion to U.S. democracy. They were inspired by Franklin Roosevelt. They were part of that progressive generation, that, you know, the New Deal, and, you know, we can solve problems together, come let us reason together, and, you know, all of that. And it was kind of a second burst of what America's founders were filled with. And I had that in spades. I still do, but I just assumed that if the facts were as they had been outlined by Professor Revelle, and then since by thousands and thousands of others, that the United States of America would take hold of this, and our democracy would process it and come up with the solutions, and there you go, problem solved. And it didn't happen that way. And being in a position to try to move it forward and meeting resistance just made me more determined to keep pushing forward. I do think, by the way, that the world is now moving in the right direction. It's easy to find sources of despair or discouragement. You can find them easily. But if you want to take the big picture view, what's happened since Paris is really quite remarkable. And by the way, the investor community worldwide is really playing an extremely significant role, in some ways a more significant role than governments. Governments can be very fickle. I say that as an American in the year 2017. I don't want to get started on that, but you can pick out some other governments around the world and come to the same conclusion. But once there is a big shift in the investment marketplace, then that generates a momentum that's really unstoppable. We have the benefit of really significant technology cost reduction curves, like Moore's Law, a number of others that people here are more expert on than I am. But that now characterizes solar energy, wind energy, batteries, electric vehicles, LEDs, a whole raft of efficiency improvements. We now have these digital tools, high performance computing, AI, the Internet of Things, an interconnected global marketplace. And what we're seeing is the emergence of a sustainability revolution that has the magnitude of the Industrial Revolution, the scale of the Industrial Revolution, but the speed of the digital revolution. And it's happening so quickly and so powerfully. Investors are looking at the risks of stranded assets, $22 trillion potentially of subprime carbon assets, and the opportunities as we see the transformation and retooling of business and industry worldwide. So I'm really extremely optimistic, even though it is a race against time. We saw in the last couple of weeks in the Western Hemisphere with Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Irma. I mean, today the water's waist deep in Manila. Last week, 2/3 of Bangladesh was underwater. There are a couple of typhoons stalking Asia right now, luckily not the giant kind. But we're disrupting the water cycle, raising temperatures, threatening crop yields. I won't go through the parade of horribles, but it's a big parade, and this is for real. This is for real. And it's getting worse. But we now have the solutions, and we just have to get on with it and implement them quickly.
So, in the film, there are times when you say what you just said, which is, the facts are so clear to me, how do I explain it to others? And if I'm trying to extract from Vice President Gore the formula for leading a successful movement here, right? As you guys see as we go through the interview. And that communication bit of the formula, like how do you really get across your point and keep doing it in a way that doesn't frustrate you? It's a bit of an expanded version of the how do you keep going question. But how are you breaking through on communications?
I'm not sure that I am. I'm trying to.
You are. Like we're all signed up, right? As investors, as citizens.
I just don't want to pose as an expert on strategic communication. Somebody says, "Well, how'd you do that whole slideshow?" And I said, "Well, it only took me 40 years." I mean, it's if you work on something long enough, you're going to get better at it. If you're asking me what I think is the key to successful persuasion, again, without posing as an expert, I'm not comfortable doing that because I don't think I qualify. But I would say that from my standpoint, first and foremost is communicating the passion that you feel. If you are really wholeheartedly committed to what you're trying to communicate, you have to be in touch with that and try to convey that. And then the words will come. But what people connect with is the emotion and the passion and the commitment. And sometimes that can be misinterpreted as, if you don't have any doubt about it, is that arrogance? by the latest measurement, 99.9% of all of the peer-reviewed scientific journal articles agree with this. You know, if you were fortunate enough, if you had, God forbid, chest pains that got worse, and you had the ability to consult with the 1,000 leading heart cardiologists in the world, and 999 of them said, oh, you got to take this medicine, start exercising, and change your diet, and you found one that said, no problem, don't worry about it, what would you do? Well, we all know some people who would take the one, I guess, but you know, that's sort of where we are. We are at a new stage, if I can sort of elaborate just briefly on this, because one of the reasons why some people kind of resist embracing the conclusion that the climate crisis is for real and we've really got to deal with it urgently is that it seems so different from times past. How could we be in this mess? Well, there are three things that have combined to radically change the relationship between humanity and the ecological system of the Earth. Number one is population. We've quadrupled our numbers in less than 100 years. And so the impact humans have on the ecological system is obviously much greater. We know how to deal with that. That's a success story unfolding in slow motion. You gotta educate girls, empower women, make fertility management ubiquitously available, and reduce child mortality rates so that parents are confident having smaller families. And when you have all four of those conditions present, it's like magic. The demographic system shifts country by country from an equilibrium that has large families, high death rates, high birth rates, down an S curve to small families, low death rates, low birth rates. It happens if you have the educate girls, empower women, make fertility management available, reduce child mortality. There are still places in the world where those conditions have not been put in place. The one that's lagging is fertility management, and in sub-Saharan Africa and some parts of South Asia, that's still an issue. Largely as a result, by mid-century Africa will have more people than either China or India, and by end of century Africa will have more people than China and India combined. But in most of the world, this demographic shift is taking place. So that's the first. Population growth has really changed our relationship to the planet. Second, the power of the technologies available now is unimaginable compared to what our grandparents had. And so the impact of each individual on average is much, much greater. But the third factor is the most important one, and that's our way of thinking. That has the most leverage. Are we just focused on the short term? Are we going to be oblivious to important material factors that come out of the decisions we make? And that's where the investor community can have the most leverage. Everybody knows that shifting to a longer term focus, particularly for pension funds, but any kind of long-term manager has to make that shift. And when you do that, you can drive the change in thinking that's necessary for our civilization as a whole. In any case, these things have combined to really create an ecological crisis. And it's like a collision between human civilization as it's presently organized and the ecological system of the planet. And the climate crisis is by far the most significant because the sky is the most vulnerable part. You know, if you could drive a car at normal speeds straight up in the air, you get to the top of the sky in 5 to 10 minutes. It's very, very thin. It's a thin shell surrounding the planet. And we're using it as an open sewer now. And because the gaseous waste is so great, we're filling it up in ways that trap a lot of heat energy. We put another 110 million tons up there every single day. It's now stabilized for the last 3 years, and it has to start coming down. But the cumulative amount now traps as much extra heat energy every day as would be released by 400,000 first-generation atomic bombs exploding every 24 hours.
That sounds good.
And 93% of that heat energy goes into the oceans. That's why the water cycle of the world is being disrupted. That's why we get these giant downpours all over the world on a regular basis. In Houston, a week before last, you've seen pictures of Niagara Falls. Some of you have been there. Houston got the equivalent of 500 days of the full flow of Niagara Falls right into the middle of Houston, Texas, over a 4-day period. Unbelievable. And at the same time, though the Western press didn't cover it very much, here in Asia, 1/3 of Bangladesh was underwater. India got 70 centimeters over and above, of rain over and above what the monsoon normally brings. 10 times as many people died in India and Nepal and Bangladesh, some in Pakistan, compared to those who were victims in Texas. 100,000 homes disrupted in Nigeria, a historic downpour. I mean, this is for real. And it's getting worse. It is getting worse. But again, we have the ability to change course. We are now in the midst of changing course. And my message, I don't want to hijack your question, I'll end with this. The investor community, especially here in Asia, I know of no reason to doubt the predictions that this is the Asian century. And the savings rate in Asia is so much larger in the world than in the world generally. This community can avoid avoidable risk and seize the greatest opportunities in the history of business and commerce by looking clearly at the new reality we face and deploying assets accordingly.
The movie, an inconvenient sequel. You described extreme weather events. You say clearly it's getting worse. Why the sequel now?
People have encouraged me to do a sequel to the first movie for quite a while, and it seemed that the 10-year anniversary would be an appropriate time to ask audiences for permission to come back and present what's new. And there have been two big changes in the last decade. Number one, the crisis is getting worse. Not only the downpours, but also the droughts. The connection of the drought in the Eastern Mediterranean to the Syrian diaspora and the knock-on consequences in the European Union is one example. The movement of tropical diseases poleward, the melting of the ice, the raising of sea levels, etc. Problem is worse. But the second big change is we have the solutions now. We have the solutions now. And the movement in all over the world toward electrification of transportation, the shift to renewable sources of electricity, the development of cost-effective batteries, the deployment of LEDs, sustainable agriculture, forestry, and fishing, building efficiency to deal with the 25% of global warming pollution that's just from inefficient built environments around the world, which, by the way, is a very jobs intensive task of upgrading them. And a lot of things are coming together. India's just announced that within 13 years, 100% of all their new cars and trucks will have to be electric vehicles. China just announced 2 days ago they're completely phasing out the internal combustion engine. They haven't set the date yet, but that's in progress. The UK and France just announced that they're going to take longer than India, but they're also saying that their new vehicles at a date certain will have to be all electric. Every automobile manufacturer in the world is now rolling out or preparing to roll out electric vehicles, plug-in electrics. This shift is happening. Solar and wind, India, again, has done a U-turn. They've closed 37 coal mines this year. They are shutting down a bunch of coal-fired generating plants. Their planning commission said within 4 years there will be no new coal plants. There probably won't be any before then. As you know very well, because you cover India, the coal industry has a lot of clout there, and it plays a big role in their economy. But the levelized cost of energy from solar is now on an unsubsidized basis so much cheaper than electricity from burning coal in India that, you know, it's an unstoppable movement. In the United States, solar jobs are now growing 17 times faster than other jobs in the economy. The single fastest growing job is wind turbine technician. You have Republican states in the Midwest who are now so excited about wind and solar that somebody comes in with a proposal for more subsidies for coal or oil. They say, what, are you kidding me? And so this is really beginning to shift. But we're in a race against time, and the legacy power of fossil fuel companies in many countries is such that they still have the ability to slow down this transition. I don't want to make them the bad guys. It's just human nature, and they've acquired these assets and these networks of political influence, and that's the way it works. But investors who can adopt a clear view of where we're going in the future have the opportunity, and I would argue the obligation to their asset owners and their clients to really advocate for a clear-eyed view of where we should be going instead of surrendering to the narrow interests that some of these lobbying communities pursue.
One last question. The room is a mix of genders, but is predominantly female. Watching the film last night, it really struck me the role that women have played in the climate change movement. You know, if you went and led these trainings, these climate change trainings, the audience was often women. In the Paris meeting, there are a lot of female leaders on that stage. What role did women play in this movement? And as you know, a room of women leaders who can mobilize a lot of capital in Asia, what advice or what thoughts would you leave with them in terms of women leadership today? Big question for this group. So it's almost as big as my first one, so I thought I'd end in another big one.
Well, the shepherd of the Paris negotiation was Christiana Figueres, Costa Rican born, educated in Germany and the US, did really a fantastic job. There's so many places I could go with your question. It is true that polling in almost every country shows that for whatever reason, women are more likely to be concerned about and attentive to protection of the environment. We could all speculate why that is the case. Some conclusions appear to be obvious. But it's another reason why the empowerment of women is so crucial. And everybody here is empowered, but we also have to fight against toxic cultures that limit the voices of women who are empowered. When groups make decisions, how do they draw upon the wisdom of the crowd? If a group works smoothly and well together, then that group is smarter than the smartest person in the group. I wrote a book earlier this year that gave me the opportunity to do a deep dive into this subject, the wisdom of crowds, and how does collective intelligence emerge. And I know it may sound a little arcane, but I want to finish this thought. What the research shows is that the diversity of a group is absolutely, does absolutely enhance collective intelligence, because you're looking from different points of view at the same object. I'll tell you a quick story. We've got enough time. You asked me about the 2000 election. In March of 2001, after that election, I took a much-needed week-long vacation, went to the big island of Hawaii. My youngest daughter was with me. She's interested in science. I took her up to the top of one of the big extinct volcanoes there, Mauna Kea, where they have the most powerful telescopes in the world, the KEX. And they look at these supernovas and stars, and they have a lot of technological advantages, innovations, but there are two of them. And they're about 50 meters apart. And they always look at the same object. But here's the thing that impressed me. If they're looking at a star 100 million light years from Earth, the distance of 50 meters separating those two telescopes makes all the difference in the amount of meaning they can derive from what they are observing. Different points of view, sharing the same knowledge and goals, can lend so much power and bring so much extra collective intelligence to the task. The same thing is true in groups. But the research also shows this, that diversity is only an enhancer of collective intelligence if there is perceived freedom of expression and an absence of fear. If some member of the group, whether because of gender or orientation or race or religion, whatever, feels behind the eight ball, feels that there is a toxicity to the culture of the group that suppresses the impulse to share and be a part of the collective conclusion, then diversity is not an advantage. It can actually subtract from the success of the group. So diversity is essential. And since it's a cliche by now to quote the Native American saying that women hold up half the sky, but they do.
Out here they say it's Chinese saying, interestingly.
Also?
Yeah,
Also?
no.
Well, they say Native Americans came from Asia, so. But is it a Chinese saying also?
What do you guys think? I heard it was a Chinese saying, women hold up half the sky.
Well,
the Chinese are claiming it anyway.
Fine. But here's my point. There's been a big discussion, for example, in the venture capital community, in the high-tech community, and long since in other communities, about the debilitating consequences of a toxic culture that can serve to make women feel like they're not able to participate fully. What I'm saying is there is a very large macroeconomic consequence. And in the investment community, there is a large macroeconomic consequence to having a toxic culture. And I can't even remember what your original question was.
It doesn't even matter. That was a very inspirational answer. Now, I'm mindful that this session was called How to Start a Movement, but I think Vice President Gore just kind of showed us how to finish it. And he finished it with a clear call to action, not just on climate action, where the benefits are now, I mean, the problem is clear, the solution is here, and we have a lot of capital in this room, but also the benefit of diversity and leadership. And so I think we really need to end it there, because in terms of getting better than that.
Well, I'll just have one other comment, that if anybody doubts that we have the political will to solve this climate crisis, just remember that political will is itself a renewable resource.
Nice. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.